The aftermath of taking the Zell's homeworld was pretty much what you'd expect. Once they got rid of the prisoners and we could finally get out of our suits, it was simply rebuilding their homes and rebuilding their infrastructure. This was made a whole lot easier by bringing a whole bunch of fabricators with us. We brought as many as we could, but of course there are certain ones that are just too large to move. At least, unless you want to basically move an entire space station, that is. Those are the ones that sit around our asteroid field and in the Oort cloud, just creating what we need. It was a long process to get everything squared away. I spent most of the first week just patching people up inside a MASH tent that we set up right outside of my ship. Anyone who came in, I made sure they got whatever treatment I could offer for them. Unfortunately, I'm not a surgeon. I did what I could, and thankfully, within 24 hours, they sent down several of the medical frigates, those that could actually land on the planet, that is, without too much problems. One of the issues with landing a very large medical frigate, or something, well, anything bigger than a destroyer, is that the anti-grav motors cause issues with the planet. Not that they would have any problems with a low gravity planet like this, but the main issue is the fact that you would experience anti-gravity anywhere around, or suddenly gravity would be yoinking your ass in some different direction, if you're too close, that is. And the last thing we need is to cause even more casualties. Thankfully, once they got the medical frigates down and we could start healing everybody up, it went a lot smoother. I remember having a whole bunch of their children coming and they were scared of us. They saw what we did across their planet and they were sheerly petrified. One poor kid even peed himself when his mom held him out for me to check him over. Well, actually, it was her. But I assured them with a small pat on the head, "It's okay. You'll be okay." They could understand what I was saying thanks to the translator, but it was difficult to say the least. Many of them were squirming and didn't know what to do. I ended up draining my entire organic supply of material and ended up not eating for 3 days, 3.5 to be exact, before I had a chance to restock. For those that don't fully understand it, the fabricators only work with either non-organic or organic materials. There is no mix and match here. It doesn't work that way. You can't make food out of petroleum, and you can't make a tire out of a ear of corn. It doesn't happen. It just doesn't work that way. That being said, I was able to feed a few. Unfortunately, after a while, I had to tell them I had nothing left. I even invited them into the ship to see that the stocks were empty. They pulled out a couple cylinders of metal and asked if I could simply use this in the fabricator to make food, which obviously I can't do. It's the wrong type. It's just doesn't work. Although once I got some extra help, it was not too difficult. It was kind of interesting finding a few people working next to me and asking me when's the last time I ate, as my stomach was rumbling like crazy, especially when somebody pulled out a protein bar and just started chowing down on it next to me. Yeah, nice to see somebody's been starving for that long. Then was the reconstruction of their infrastructure. I'm not an engineer, but hey, I can lift and carry things just like anyone else. Thankfully, with the Zells being so small, we didn't have to move all that much. Their version of an I-beam could be lifted by 2 or 3 of us, even without the help of an exosuit. With the exosuit, we could just pick it up, one in each hand, and just walk it over and set it down. It was crazy. At least it must have looked that way. But we were there to help, and it wasn't long before they were so happy that we were around. It was just insane. The smiles, at least their version of it, and the kids would come up and try to play with us. We had to tell them to be careful because the tools we were working with were still tools and still dangerous. They weren't toys. One poor kid decided to turn on an electric drill and drop it on his foot. Poor kid broke his toe. Thankfully, I could bring him over to the regeneration area, and yeah, he got fixed up really quick. It still was a long time before we got the roads and enough buildings set aside so that everybody could be relatively comfortable. And then we had to move on to a more pressing issue. You see, The Zell's planet had been strip mined, similar to what Earth was experiencing when we came back. The only issue is they had been strip mined at least 20 times worse. It might have been a smaller planet, but still it was terrible. A lot of the topsoil was just gone. A lot of the water was just not there. It was insane. So we had to make plans to try and recover everything. I found it very interesting that the Chitter planet wasn't stripped like this was. It was still semi-lush and green and all that, but I don't understand. Why did they have it out for this planet so much? Were the Zells just that desired as slave labor? I mean, yeah, because their size and they're intelligent, they make very good additions to my crew, but what in the flying hells? It was driving us crazy. While this was going on, every once in a while, another slave ship would enter the system. Our folks up there in space, while I was stuck here on the ground, made very quick work of those ships. Even as an entire flotilla showed up, the largest one I was told was 4 destroyers, 7 frigates, a couple of corvettes, and a butt ton of fighters. They immediately detached their fighters, but by then our main battleships were already firing on the destroyers, and it was, shall we say, a short battle. A very short battle. Because once the main ships were gone, for some reason, they didn't put any type of FTL motors inside of their fighter craft, which meant that they immediately wanted to surrender. At least they would have if they weren't freaking drones. The only ones that tried to surrender was the frigates and the corvettes when they realized they were severely outgunned and they had already been locked on. Unfortunately for them, once we fire the torpedoes and the missiles, there's not really much we can do about that. You kind of feel bad about it, but the ordnance was already on its way. What do you want us to do? We're not putting an abort code in there, because if we do and they figure it out, they'll simply blow our own ordnance while it's still inside the magazine. We couldn't risk it. So while that was going on, it was time to deal with this big issue we had, and that was having enough land itself, enough viable land to grow crops for the Zells. Now, their type of fauna was very strange to us. However, the basics of growing it were pretty much the same. They had their shrub plants, their basic garden plants, viney, all this sort of things. They had even a version of tomatoes, which was, we found out, extremely close to our cherry tomatoes. We intermixed the two and came up with a much, much desired food source for them. Along with that, we found out that their version of trees are only about as tall as I was. It was really interesting. Kind of a mix between an apple tree and a bonsai tree. It was kind of funny when they're saying, we can't reach the stuff on top, and I just kind of reach over, grab it, pull it off, and hand it off to somebody. This whole process takes months. It is not easy to get crop fields ready. Anybody who's even started a garden knows this. It takes a lot of preparation and a lot of time. Sometimes your first yield is complete garbage, and you need to work out the kinks. And since we had never worked with any of these plants before, we had a lot of kinks to work out. Our luck in the whole deal was the fact that the local population did know how to grow these plants. Their bigger issue was the fact that they did not have a very good protein source. Their oceans had been almost completely fished out by their slave masters. It was just horrible. Almost every single one. And most of the remaining fish were so damn small. I'm looking at it, holding one in my hand, and the damn thing's only as long as my palm. I'm like, what in the hell? This might feed a child. This is not enough for an adult, and this is all you could find? It was like 4 or 5 of these things? This is pathetic. I actually chucked the fish back in, and they freaked out. I told them, don't worry, I just got restocked on my fabricator. I'll make dinner. And I made the best dinner I could find for them. Well, at least using a fabricator. Let's just say you can tell the difference between fabricated food and real food. I much prefer real food. At the end of 8 months, we got our first harvest, and they had their own version of a harvest festival. I was sitting there talking to the remainder of my crew, and I had to inform them that now that everything has been settled, now that their planet is safe, and now that they have the ability to fight and protect themselves, we won't be around much. I'll come and visit, of course. With that, they all understood, except for Junior. He was off playing. I remember the new younger sister of his was just sitting there being cradled. I don't think she'd ever remember me being as young as she was. It reminded me way back in the day, way back in my time when I was a soldier. Of that time, my nieces and nephews, I would see them when they're really young, but I wouldn't be back for years, and then they wouldn't recognize me. And then I'd be stuck being gone again for a couple years. I'd come back, and they still don't know who the hell I am unless somebody told me I was coming. It was like that. I simply looked at her mom. She had tears in her eyes, knowing that I would be gone for a long time, and I would miss some of the important steps in the child's life, but I'm not the father of these children. And then, as we sat there speaking about it, as emotions started to get to me, they started to break me up. I was having trouble keeping it together. Thankfully, one of the lieutenants was across the table from me, and he heard the whole conversation. And he came up with probably the best idea ever. He said, "Well then, why don't you simply be the godfather?" I felt like an idiot not thinking that before. They asked what a godfather was, and explained that a godfather, even if not related by blood of any reason, was considered a guardian, a protector, a third parent, if you will. And if anything should happen, the godparent is to take care of the children if the parents are no longer able to do so. They agreed to this. My whole crew even said if they had any more children, if they found mates, if they were able to have any more, that they would be my godchildren. I would be the godfather. I very much tried to stop from one of the jokes, trying to take a piece of cotton off my uniform, shove it in my cheek, and make a joke about that really bad movie back in the day, but I couldn't think of any of the lines. It was so long ago, so long ago, I'd forgotten about it completely. The next morning, I didn't even wake them up. All my Zell friends were knocked out cold from all they drank. But as I walked to the ship, Junior ran up to me, and he latched onto my leg. I kneeled down and looked at him, and I told him what was going on, and he started to cry. And then I told him I would always watch over him. And with that, I gave him a small device, a small, almost amulet that he could wear around his neck. I showed him if he was ever in trouble, he needs to take this amulet, and there was a small seam. He needs to twist it until it breaks. And when it breaks, he's going to see a small wire. At that point, he needs to pull the wire apart. When that happens, it's going to send a signal. That signal is going to be caught by the satellites, and it's going to be sent to find me. It is set on a very certain frequency, and I will know exactly where you are, and I will come to help you. He looked at me again, then he looked at the amulet. Then I took the wire, the small string around the back, and I tied it behind his neck. It laid very, very low down past his chest, as he was just such a small kid. But he smiled to me, and he simply asked, "When will you come back?" I simply put my hand on his shoulder, even though only 2 of my fingers fit. And I said, I'll be back when I can. Just do me a favor. Can you be strong while I'm gone? Can you protect everyone while I'm gone? Can you be strong and stoic like me as I straighten myself up, put my fist on my chest, right above my heart? Can you be that for me? Can you be the strong one that everyone can rely on? Can you be that for me? He looked, he said, I don't know if I can. You're so strong. I knelt down and said, I know you will grow up to be strong too. You can grow up to be stronger than me. With that, you couldn't wipe the grin on his face off if you tried. And I simply stood back up and walked to my ship. I could see from the bridge as I powered everything up. He was still there watching. I motioned for him to back up because the downdraft, even though the anti-grav motors don't actually have a thrust, the downdraft that happens from the anti-grav motors is enough to actually send him for a little tumble. Thankfully, he did back up several steps, and he kept backing up as he could hear the motors spinning up. Eventually, I lifted off, and I made sure it was very slow and methodical as I went back to the fleet. The fleet was going to leave. They were going to leave 2 battle groups behind just to watch over them, the same way they left 2 battle groups on the Chitter homeworld. Each of these would take position around the poles of the planets, northern and southern, far enough away that they didn't get in the way of their own magnetosphere, but close enough that if anything happened from any direction, they'd be able to respond. It'd been a long time, and I just wanted to go home. Although, I wouldn't be going home alone. What I had not mentioned this far is that we had additional help. We called these new genetically designed slaves demons because that's what they look like. For some reason, most of them are designed with like a pointy ears or horns or something like that. It's strange. They're always different colors. Some are jet black with blonde hair. Some are jet black with solid white hair. Others are blue. They're purple. They're red. It was strange. You don't see this naturally by any other group of aliens, with the exception of plumage from the male avian species, and usually that's only during their mating season. These are permanent. It was very, very odd. But now that I had a new crew of 6 different ones of these genetically modified creatures. But I call them creatures, but they look very, very human. They seem to be modeled off our own template. 5 fingers on each hand, 5 toes on each foot. Most of them, though, what was very freaky is they were young. And when I say young, I mean very young. The youngest looked like they were about 10, and the oldest maybe pushing 17, and I stress the maybe part. The kicker is, even though there seemed to be no personality behind them at first, eventually, the more time they spent with others, the more time they spent without those stupid collars on, which I enjoyed ripping those things off, even though it scared the living bejesus out of them. The more time they started conversing. At first they didn't speak, they simply just nodded and they would move out if you told something. But now they spoke full sentences. Now they carried on full conversations, and now they started developing their own personalities, their own personas. And with that, I was grateful, because it would take a lot of training to figure out where they would end up in the great galactic map. I couldn't figure out any other way to say it. It did take a lot for me to actually get 6 crew members for this ship, but most of them were up in my Corvette anyway, with a lot more room to move around. After docking, I got a hold of the fleet, sent in my call sign, and told them I was heading back towards Earth. I wanted to know who else was going back with me, and to my shock and surprise, almost the entire fleet was heading back in 2 days. So I checked my reserves and I said, okay, 2 days it is. And while we waited, I introduced my new crew to a few games. Mostly board games, of course. Chess, checkers, backgammon, Othello, things of that nature. Things that I could easily find a template for and have the fabricator create. I would simply have to remember what in the hell the rules were for most of these, although most of the ones I had were pretty simple. The kicker is, I wanted them to understand strategy games because I needed them to understand that there is a multitude of things they have to analyze in every situation. It wouldn't matter how young they are, their training has already begun. When they weren't playing the games and it was time to train, they were taught on the engines, the weapon systems, the anti-grav motors, how the fabricators worked, techniques, logistics, all this sort of thing. I even showed them how to use their own base weapon systems, as in rifles and pistols. They were a little hesitant about this because they saw what we humans could do with them. I had to remind them, don't worry, you're not using explosives and these are unloaded because how do I know it's unloaded? And they all recited, you always treat a weapon as though it is loaded, which I had drummed into them from day one. Within 2 days, we were on our way. We made a short stop at the Chitter's home planet, and it was quiet. Very quiet. The battle groups were there. I could see them on my sensors, especially when I was plugged in. But we were so close that if you just took even binoculars and looked through one of the portals, you could see the ships way off in the distance. They were about the size of half a grain of rice, but you could see them. Some of them shined a little bit. Well, that was just one of the sides of the Corvettes. The Corvettes tend to not have a lot of the extra shielding on them as they're designed specifically for speed and little else. A few more jumps later and we were back into the Sol sector. And as we got close to that blue marble floating in space, I took a deep breath. We're home. And then I turned and looked at my crew. They were all looking out the bridge window and looking at Earth. It's the first time they had seen it. And the youngest one just kind of looked at me and said, home? Well, I thought this was our home, as he motioned towards the bulkhead itself. I said, no. Home is not a ship. A home is your planet. But we don't have a planet, we were said. Well, now you do. Welcome home, I said as I stretched my arm out, again motioning towards Earth. They were amazed by what they saw down there when we finally got to the bottom. We were at the academy, and everyone was shocked to see these new type of aliens. They had been briefed, of course, as it had been almost 9 months in total by the time we had picked them up. I showed them around, introduced them to as many people as possible, and tried to get them into any type of club they could, just because they needed to be kids for once. One of the reasons they didn't have much of a personality is because they never got to be children. They never got to experience any of that. They simply were considered organic automatons, for lack of a better term. I had no interest in that. The only interest I had was making sure they were well trained and ready to take off on their own in a few years, and also to make sure they were ready for this insanely dangerous universe we were in. It's just absolutely freaking nuts. I've lost count of how many times I've put my life on the line for other species, how many times I've got into a pickle and just thought, okay, my number is going to be called. Now it's time to just go back to teaching classes, making sure everyone's ready, and making sure my new family is safe and secure. It would be 3 years before I would ever have to head back into space inside my exosuit getting ready for a fight. In 3 years, a lot of things change. In 3 years, I had brought my Corvette in to be completely refurbished, along with my fighters. I had everything taken down to its base elements and rebuilt again to my specifications, because I realized that even though we had freed 2 species, eventually some may show up at our doorstep either looking for freedom or looking for a fight. And with the vastness of space, with the fact that we are the only ones who use a jump system and they use FTL being much, much more difficult to use in relation to surprising anyone, because you can't just blink into an area. But another area of contention, one thing we talked about a lot, and when I mean we, I mean those of us in the academy that decided we need to understand the enemy. We realized something. We realized why it took so long for them to bring entire flotillas, entire battle groups, and not even entire fleets yet into the Sol sector. Why did it take so long? Well, it takes long to rally that type of force. Well, we realized we had just pissed on a hornet's nest. We didn't know if they'd realize who had actually got them, but from the fact that a whole bunch of reinforcements had shown up, they knew there was a group out there that was willing and able to fight through several different species that were carrying their version of heavy weapons in order to liberate one species. The culture in and of the universe itself was that of dominance and submission, master and servant. We had walked into, or been dragged into in this case, a universe that believed this universal constant. Well, we don't exactly go by that constant, and if they realize it's us, they're going to come at us with a lot of shit. So I wanted to make sure we were ready. My new Corvette was sleek in its design. The hull plating was reset specifically because the new engineers had figured out something ingenious. Oh, I love those crazy evil bastards. They come up with some of the weirdest stuff. But we send in our designs, things we've jazzed up our own systems with, and they can do amazing work with that. Sometimes we'll just open up a whole can of worms, and people have to bring in their ships to be refabricated just constantly. Thankfully, by my service and by my rank, I was authorized to use the fabricators to work anything I wanted. I increased the number of torpedo launchers, even had some ballistic turrets strapped on, which were retractable, had my standard energy turrets, my main guns, and all that other whiz-bang stuff that we got. But also, several of the cargo compartments were designed specifically to hold fighters. In particular, my Warbird and another 5 others. This sucker was loaded for bear. But on top of that, of course, the internals were jammed packed with creature comforts that were not seen on many ships. This is where I kind of had to pull a few strings and actually go into space and retrieve materials to trade with so that I could use the massive fabricators to get this done. Each of my crew members have their own room. Their own room is not as stuffy as a small closet like you would think, but an actual full-on room with its own lavatory facilities, its own latrine, its own shower. There was a public bath for everyone to use, which was sealed when not in use. That way, in case the anti-grav motors failed, it didn't go all over the damn place. Which I did find out later that my new crew were a little too comfortable walking around after a bath without anything on. Guys, I'm a little too old for this. Well, you're never actually too old, but you get the idea. They actually didn't get the idea. So I just had to deal with it. It was now, I figured, part of their culture, so ingrained that I wasn't going to fight it. But aside from those creature comforts was an entire galley full of items. I had preserved foods. I had all sorts of things lined up along with the fabricator system so that we could make whatever we wanted and it could be much tastier. Never underestimate how well a warm, good meal is when you're out on patrol or when you're away from your friends and family for a long time. It's a huge morale boost. We had our own game rooms. And yes, rooms. One was mainly for things like billiards and ping pong and things of that nature. But we had a small, very small area where you could actually shoot hoops. Although the hoop itself was retractable because, well, I like racquetball. With all this combined, you could barely consider it a Corvette now, and many people took the design because I put it publicly, and they did things very similar. In fact, they did things so similar that aside from a couple little design twists, it became standardized for large crews, anything over 4. On top of that, my Warbird got broken down as well. The new torpedoes they had were slightly smaller, so we could carry at least 4 more torpedoes in the tubes. They still weren't reloadable because there just wasn't room for reloads. Not to mention a reloading system would take up way too much space. Besides, more often than not, we're firing a full volley anyway, so it doesn't really matter. The missiles were actually given more to grab a hold of. The pylons that are usually underneath the wings now have some on the dorsal side of the wings as well. Along with that, there's an actual inboard magazine on both the ventral and dorsal side, along with a small one on the starboard and port sides. You know what? You never want to run out of missiles. Along with that, I was able to make sure that every single one of the turrets was automated, hooked up to me whenever I'm in the command couch. These warbirds were definitely something to be afraid of, especially since not only had I pulled out the main laser, the main strong one that's usually there, our pulse weapons seem to work a hell of a lot better. So instead of 1 main energy laser and 2 pulse lasers, I basically had them set up in a triangular pattern to fire one right after the other, so I could do an actual strafing run. And yes, I did put it right where you think I put it. I had the first Warbird A-10 Warthog. And yes, a lot of people took that design, but many people had 8 barrels or 6 instead of just 3. So they fired at a rate that was absolutely insane. I just didn't have enough room with all the extra missiles and torpedoes I put in. Along with that, I made sure all of them were ready to rock and roll with the best engines I could find. And the key thing there was the engineers had figured out the new stealth system. Using the captured ships from both the Chitter and the Zell's home planet, we had been able to decipher exactly how they were able to find any of our ships. Now, the stealth system barely worked on anything bigger than a frigate still, just because the ships are so damn large. However, anything Corvette size and smaller was completely undetectable outside visual range. And once you're that close, if somebody fires a torpedo or a missile, good luck dodging. With all this combined, it seems as though fighter combat in space might become an actual reality. What we had been doing before had been sheer luck, hitting them with numbers and an incredibly high amount of ordnance. But now, things are coming full circle again. Even though battleships are extremely dangerous, we could actually swarm them with enough fighters to take out a battleship with just a handful of us, just like we could back in the day. My new crew, my new demonic crew, always kept asking me whenever I did an upgrade, why do you do this? Why do you need stuff like this? And I would always respond with the same answer. Better to have and not need than need and not have. And in this case, I really hate it when I'm right.